wonderful presentation on English proficiency levels. We're going to be focusing on the secondary. At the beginning level, well, they're just starting off, which is, hence the name beginning. It says that the comprehension may be demonstrated non-verbally or through the native language. That's important to know, okay? Because sometimes they'll understand, they just don't have the skills to tell you they understand. Proficiency level number 2 for early intermediate, they are developing the ability to communicate within the school context, okay? Errors are going to impede basic communication, so remember that, but they're starting to get there. Proficiency level 3 intermediate, well, now we're getting places, okay? So they can communicate across a range of the grade level appropriate language demands. Yes, they have errors that will interfere with communication and comprehension. Repetition negotiation, in other words, you're saying something and then you're going to say it again but a little bit different. Okay, those things, that's going to help out. Proficient, well now, hey, they're pretty much getting to the point where they're going to be an independent learner. Are there problems? Yes, there's still going to be some issues, but they're going to get there, okay? Above proficient, well, now that's when they're shifting gears to become the valedictorian and make everybody else feel bad because these people started off not even speaking English and they beat everybody academically, right? I mean, they're knocking heads. So that's where above proficient is. So quickly we're going to do a rundown of middle school and then high school. I wanted you to check this out. These, of course, are your 5 levels. If you notice, above proficient is, well, there's not that many. 2 reasons. Number 1, that's a difficult place to be. Number 2, well, when they're that high up, they also graduate out of ELs. So think about that. So moving right along, grades 6 through 8. Beginning, well, look at it, pretty much says the same thing. They're beginning to develop receptive and productive skills. And if you notice, reading, writing, listening, speaking, reading and listening are your receptive, writing and speaking are your productive, okay? So think about it when you're working with the EL kids. Is it easier or harder to make homemade lasagna versus eating it? Okay? That's kind of that's the way this language works. It's a whole lot easier to listen to people and understand what they're saying than to turn around and use words to express your understanding of it. So early intermediate reading, they can interpret the high frequency idioms. Writing, well, they can attempt to describe something, okay, a picture, a preference. There will be errors. Listening, they can recall the basic details of a classroom discussion. And for speaking, well, that student can produce words and phrases for social situations and giving directions. Okay, so those are kind of low-level requirements for language. Intermediate side of things, reading, well, now they have the high-frequency affixes to determine word meaning. So they're starting to be able to understand words, pull them apart. They have the synonyms of your high frequency social and academic vocabulary. Listening, well, now they can do multi-step directions, okay? Before it was simple directions, now we're moving on up, okay? For writing, subject verb agreement starting to kick in. Hey, that's good. And then for speaking, they can tell a simple story. Okay? Telling a simple story is a lot easier than having discourse about something. So intermediates doing better, but they're not quite there. So here we are at proficient. Reading, man, they can recall stated and implicit details. That's pretty tough. They can read for specific information. They can determine the main idea in a fiction text. I mean, that's kind of hard to do, right? So, man, these proficient people got it going on. Students in writing can use correct grammar. And then these verbs down at the bottom on here, I did that for my ELA friends, right? They can describe, explain, compare, persuade, express. I mean, those are verbs that you use in assignments when you're doing in an ELA class. Listening, well, they got the main idea of the classroom discussion. They can infer directions, simple conclusions. For speaking, they can express an opinion, which to me isn't a requirement to be a proficient speaker. However, they can provide that information, conduct transactions, make request, they can give directions and describe locations. And then, of course, they can continue to tell a simple story, but this time their vocabulary and grammar are looking good. Above proficient, reading, I mean, they can use prediction to read fluently. They can recall subtle details. They can identify the author's purpose. For listening, they can draw conclusions and summarize a task. Speaking, well, they can produce sophisticated vocabulary. They can explain a process. And for writing, well, they can tell the difference between a complete sentence and a run on, and their communication's clear and complete. So you're above proficient, those are your independent learners. So grades 9 through 12. Once again, for beginning, it, it, it looks the same because it is the same. Okay, that means they're just starting off. I mean, you need to go full tilt visual. You need to allow them ways to use their native language. You need to figure out ways that they can communicate, even if it requires charades. Okay, so early intermediate reading, they can divide words into an affix and a root word, so they can see some parts in there. Writing, they can describe that picture or explain a preference. They can use simple phrases. Listening, multi-step directions. There we go. For speaking, they can describe those social situations. They can explain personal preferences, okay? Well, of course, those are the first things you learn when you're learning a language. You want to talk about things that allow you to have friends, okay? So there you are with speaking. So from early intermediate to intermediate, we're taking it up a notch. Reading, you got high frequency affixes. They can determine word meanings. They can identify synonyms of the high frequency, social, and academic vocab, and they can recall stated and implicit details in a simple narrative. Key being simple, right? Listening, simple academic vocabulary, they can recall details. Speaking, they can use appropriate words and phrases when providing information, expressing a preference, conducting a transaction, describing a location. So those verbs, I highlighted those for you. That way, when you're making an assignment, you're like, is this kid going to be capable to express a preference? Well, then, yes, they can. And for writing, they can use correct grammar. How awesome is that? And they can describe a picture. Proficient, and holy moly, as you notice, the higher up we go in language, the more junk they want to include in these things. So this is very busy, so I apologize. However, I did highlight the important bits. So for reading, they can use the knowledge of the lower frequency affixes. So now it's not the most common ones. Now they're starting to get, on the periphery of language, like, oh, look at these neat words that are lying over here. So they can interpret figurative expressions, determine the main idea, infer information. So now they're pretty much able to hang in there with your ELA classes, all right? Writing, tense agreement, so they got that. They can differentiate between the complete sentences and fragments, and they can write to describe, explain, compare, persuade, or express. And of course, they can use accurate vocabulary. For listening, man, this word subtle details, that's so important. And then they can determine key information. And for speaking, they can describe those locations and processes. They can use accurate vocabulary. They can describe personal experiences, and they can tell simple stories. But look at that, the part that I underlined next to tell a simple story says with mostly correct vocabulary and grammar. So they are almost there. And then above proficient, for reading, I mean, they can determine word meaning, identify rhyming words, use prediction in order to read fluently. They can infer information and explain author techniques. I mean, there's some teachers out there that's a dream come true if their students can do all that. For listening, they can draw conclusions about a character in an oral story. And then for writing, they can write fluently to describe a picture, explain a preference, and it says there still might be minor errors. Okay, but that's they can communicate what they need to communicate. They are doing well for that above proficient. And for speaking, they have this sophisticated vocabulary down pat. They can use complex sentence structures, they can give directions, describe locations, tell simple stories, and it says using accurate vocabulary and correct grammar. All right, so once again, you're above proficient. That's your high flyers, and and once they get to that point, they typically are going to graduate out of EL services and move on to monitor for the next little bit. But those are your different levels that the Lost Links provides. Hope this is helpful. Thanks for watching.